I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I am unfortunately not joined here today by my co-host, Jaren, but nonetheless, I will be going ahead and churning out this podcast for you guys. Today, we will be getting into the Mavericks 108-112 clutch time loss versus the Memphis Grizzlies, game 72 of the season. I think it honestly kind of begs the question at this point, is this Mavericks team one of the worst clutch time teams in the NBA? And this seems kind of obscene after they come off a game winner from Maxi Kleber in that Lakers game. But we just see time in and time out, this team have these fourth quarter collapses, or they're playing down to their opponent. Maybe it's not even necessarily anything that has to do with their clutch time record as much as it is the Mavericks just folding when they're up, getting too comfortable. Maybe, are the Mavericks the most comfortable team in the NBA? I think that is an extremely fair question. The Mavericks fourth quarter offense just completely stalled out in this one. Kyrie Irving, he had it really rough down the stretch. A guy who's notorious as a fourth quarter killer. He was unable to hit a shot, and to his credit, you could tell that he was a little bit hampered by that right foot soreness, especially after a third quarter or maybe a second quarter, if I actually recall, re-aggravation after Dillon Brooks was kind of plowing through him as he was screen navigating, and he ended up stepping on Kyrie's foot, and Kyrie kind of re-aggravated that foot. So I don't know if that was in play there, but he had a really rough fourth quarter, as did the rest of the team. The Mavericks only scored a cumulative 12 points in the fourth quarter. Really only 9, because Christian Wood got like 3 essentially kind of garbage time free throws when the Grizzlies kind of had the game sealed away there late. And the Mavericks were up by 14 around the end of the third. So it was just a really rough endeavor from that perspective, that the Mavericks couldn't even find it within themselves to put up a front or put this one away. It wasn't, they had a relatively good defensive game, contrary to some of the games of late. And the offense just was such an albatross in that fourth quarter, to quote some of those ESPN guys like Stephen A. It was completely asinine, and I'll be getting all into it today, of course. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, so getting into this one, it was essentially just the same story, different day for the Mavericks in regards to this whole lead blowing scenario that has persisted throughout, I don't know, too many games to count on two hands this season. Odd way to put it, but it at least has been like over 10 to 15 games where the Mavericks have played down to an opponent or blew a double-digit lead that they held going into the fourth quarter, or had, at the beginning of the fourth quarter or something of that nature. Anything around that or marginally around that, the Mavericks have struggled with mightily all year. And they actually played quite well for really the first, 40 minutes of the game. And just those last 8 minutes, they completely fell off a cliff. So let's get into those first 40 minutes and what went well for the Mavericks, and then what seemingly fell off a cliff for them in those last 8 minutes. So in that first quarter, the Mavericks definitely struggled a lot with Jaren Jackson Jr.'s presence, particularly his ability as a rim protector to kind of just freelance on one of the Mavericks' worst defenders in Dwight Powell, and kind of just sort of stray off of him and then act as a help side rim protector. And the Grizzlies were huge benefactors of that. I believe Jaren Jackson he only got accredited 1 block in this game, but he altered a lot of shots, and he got called for like 2 or 3 goaltendings that were very, I'm not going to say ticky-tacky, but they were very close calls. So that was something that severely inhibited the Mavericks there in that first quarter. But conversely, the Mavericks were getting some steals. They were actually pushing the tempo in transition. The Mavericks really didn't force the issue in terms of turnovers at any other point in this game, really barring that first quarter. we saw the Mavericks actually kind of convert transition opportunities into transition opportunities for themselves, like transition opportunities for the Grizzlies. The Mavericks were doing a good job playing the passing lanes and just getting out in front of things on long misses, threes that hit the back iron. The Mavericks were running, and they were definitely benefactors of that in terms of how it kind of went in tandem with their offensive flow. Josh Green was able to leak out for a few throughout the course of this game. And, the Mavericks were just creating, 5-on-4 scenarios, 4-on-3 scenarios within that transition game. And it was leading to some open threes. The Mavericks only went 11 of 36 on threes for the night. And, those shooting woes are definitely what kind of veered them off course, definitely in that second half. That goes beyond a shadow of a doubt. But throughout that first half, they really weren't doing the worst job. And, despite the effect that Jaren Jackson Jr. was having up early on, he got in a little foul trouble, and the Mavericks were persistent in terms of their ability to keep attacking him. And the Mavericks were able to roll into the second quarter with a little momentum. They were only down 28-30, and they won the second quarter 32-27. Christian Wood, he's a guy who played relatively well in that second quarter. Jaden Hardy, he caught fire a little bit during that second quarter, even more so, particularly in the third and fourth quarter. And this guy was kind of at the end of the first quarter, and he played very sparingly throughout this one, particularly really only at the end of the first quarter. But Frank Ntilikina, after being, 2 days removed from their last game, Justin Holiday did not play tonight for the Mavericks. Nor did JaVale McGee, who I thought was worth mentioning because Dwight Powell did get in foul trouble early. He only played 12 minutes in this game, and he had 3 fouls like right off the bat. So I think even the broadcast crew, Harp and Followell, were a little bit surprised that McGee didn't play in this one. So just wanted to mention that. I wasn't necessarily too head over heels about that decision process. I don't think that JaVale McGee is marginally even changing any the direction of any game. He may in a few, but we have too much of a track record from him this year of him just having this sort of wishy-washy play where he could have, 1 or 2 really good games and then just an abomination for weeks on end. And that's obviously the reason he hasn't played a lot. But nonetheless, the Mavericks were definitely able to remediate some of the that pressure that Jaren Jackson Jr. was putting on the rim, both offensively and defensively there in the second quarter, because Dwight Powell was getting ate alive in that first quarter by Jaren Jackson Jr. He was honestly, there were times where he would just post him up straight up, where he was getting a lot of offensive rebounds, or he would just take him from the perimeter, give him like a spin move. And it was a tough ask. The Mavericks weren't bringing that weak side help defender, but they started going to some more 2 big lineups towards the end of the first quarter and the second quarter. And that seemed to work as a sort of solution to the whole Jaren Jackson Jr. situation, because the Mavericks were able to, stick 1 big on him and kind of rotate, one of Maxey or even Bertans at times over to help when Jackson Jr. got in the lane. And, he experienced some struggles because of that. It definitely didn't completely inhibit his ability. Jackson's not the best passer in the world, so he kind of does get tunnel vision at times going to the rim, which was nice. It definitely didn't completely obstruct what he was doing. He was still getting through it during certain points, and the Mavericks didn't always bring the double on time, but it definitely slowed him down a bit. And the Mavericks offense started to really click, and Kyrie started to really catch fire. He knocked down, a 3 or 2. He was really the sort of steady tide that the Mavericks rode in terms of their offense throughout that first quarter. But in that second quarter, man, he had some crazy plays. He had this one play in particular where he split a double team, and then I believe it was on John Conchar, where he just did this insane Euro step, does the whole ball bring over thing. For you guys watching on YouTube, you can see what I'm doing with my hands. And then he jellies it with his right hand on the left side of the glass. And it was just an incredible play. He was kind of getting to the rim at will, really acting as that 3-level scorer that the Mavericks sorely need with Luka Doncic out. He was he had 20 points in the first half. And for all the talk that persisted with Dillon Brooks in this one, and that was a huge narrative, I thought, from this game that kind of got overshadowed by the Mavericks' offensive struggles in the fourth quarter. But Kyrie shut him up after Dillon Brooks, about a week ago when the Mavs and Grizzlies played, kind of called out the Mavericks' two superstars, Kyrie and Luka, that is, of course, for not playing in that game, even though they were battling their own respected injuries. And, he's kind of been just unhinged with some of the things he's been saying recently. And I think he thinks he's just on cloud nine or whatever. But nonetheless, the guy, I'm not going to say he's all talk, no game. He can back it up a little bit. But just some of his claims are just completely baseless. And he's just looking for smoke. And if that's going to be the case, if we're taking Kyrie versus Dillon Brooks, and we're taking Kyrie 1 million times out of 10, this Dillon Brooks, even being comparable to Kyrie agenda that he's trying to push within himself or within the Grizzlies fan base. He kind of adopts this whole us against the world mentality against like every single team. And I don't know, man. I'm just not feeling it. I think he's severely overblowing it. Nobody has really picked any battles with him. It's not even the playoffs yet. And Kyrie cooked his ass throughout a very large portion of this game, really until the fourth quarter, where a lot of Kyrie's woes were probably sort of self-derived. Maybe some of it had to do with that injury, like I had alluded to at the beginning of the podcast. But Dillon Brooks he's a huge chirper, man. And I'm not going to say he doesn't back it up at all, but he definitely doesn't back it up enough. That's to say the absolute least, of course. And, he was the primary defender on Kyrie Irving throughout the first half, and Kyrie had 20 points, 8 of 13 shooting, was just doing a seamless job, kind of running off those curl offs at times, cutting baseline to baseline, and receiving posts to where he could operate in the mid range. Kyrie has that sort of spin fade away in the post that is just absolutely lethal, like with inside 10 to 15 feet. Nailed a few of those pull up threes, was splitting double teams, was taking guys off the dribble. Just that sort of quintessential playmaking shot creator that any team would welcome. And it's just a blessing. I can't wait to have him and Luka back together. But nonetheless, obviously, it didn't work out for the Mavericks tonight, which was very depressing. But for Kyrie to be battling throughout, some of this foot soreness and some of the issues that he's going through at the moment, and still giving 110% when he's out there. He jumped for a loose ball in that second quarter that I don't even know how he got to and saved in bounds. And of course, the whole thing with Dillon Brooks, for him to, he went and got his ankle taped up. He was doing the stretches on the bench and everything, and finished the whole game. Didn't have the best finish. Everybody has off days. Kyrie definitely has a lot more good days than he has off days, to say the absolute least. But that fourth quarter was just kind of emblematic of him experiencing maybe some woes, injury related or non-injury related. And but he still battled through it, man. And you got to give it to him. He's a trooper for that. But during the second quarter, of course, the Mavericks obviously led the, oh my gosh, I cannot get this one. I apologize, guys. They rode the coattails of Kyrie, as well as, some hot shooting. They were pushing the ball continually, as I'd alluded to. Reggie Bullock made a few threes. Jaden Hardy, I think, made one or two in that second quarter. Just step backs where guys would go under him on screens. He was pulling it tonight, man. He had no fear. We're seeing him get over that rookie wall just from a confidence perspective. I don't necessarily think that was somewhere where he ever lacked, but there were times where, you could tell that he could have maybe took a little bit more heat and he deferred when he shouldn't have, just because of, having a mess up or, having a clumsy turnover or, looking inept, trying to drive to the basket on like 3 defenders at times. But I think that in this game, and really the last few games at large, we're seeing as the end of the season evolves that, has that sort of next play mentality, hey, I got to flush this and I got to keep going. And that's been really good to see. So yeah, the Mavericks go into halftime leading, I believe, 60-57. They have, this sort of slim marginal lead, but they severely slow down the Grizzlies from a defensive perspective. The Mavericks team defense, really for those first three quarters, I mean, even the fourth quarter, we saw a little bit more slippage, I guess, when it mattered most. But I just think overall, from a team perspective, like the Mavericks defense looked consistently more stout, more communicative. I know we can't necessarily accurately depict that because it's not like, I have like audio clips to present to you guys where I can hear every single thing. This is a FedEx Forum. We don't got the AAC basket mics that are notorious for being very loud. But nonetheless, the Mavericks still were able to anchor down and rotate well and, jump those passing lanes. And they were doing a really good job closing out on shooters throughout large portions of this game. I thought, I'll get more into how every guy sort of fared individually from that perspective, because I think certain guys did better than others. But just team wide, I think they did a much better job than they have done recently. And I mean, I think they're picking up they're raising the bar a little bit in terms of their defense. I think ever so slightly, just kind of barely and marginally. But I mean, you take whatever you can get at this juncture in the season with 10 games left. The Mavericks only have 10 games left. I mean, that's why this one stinks so much, guys, because it was literally just right there for the taking. And just literally the offense stalling out is the only reason that the Mavericks lost this. But, I thought the team defense was better, especially once they started, trapping late on Jaren Jackson Jr. or bringing a help side defender. That was able to remediate a lot of the woes that they were having. But they still, during different stretches, particularly during that fourth quarter, they started conceding some threes, and they were kind of, it just seemed as if there was a little bit more of a cushion for the Grizzlies to operate with. The Mavericks tapped into some zone in the third and fourth quarter for very brief stretches, might I add. I mean, it wasn't anything that was consistent, but it kind of, that's more just of a personnel issue at that point, right? Because it did seem as if the Mavericks had, really made a concerted effort to stop Jaren Jackson Jr. And his dribble drive game and his post-up game and just the overall pressure he was bringing into the interior. But by doing that, it definitely, guys are just a little bit more backed off the perimeter, if in case they need to help last minute or anything like that. And the Grizzlies were doing a really good job moving the ball around the horn, and they were getting shots up tonight, man. And they definitely had a little bit of negative regression in terms of their shooting tonight. But when it mattered most, they made a few threes late in that fourth quarter. Santi Aldama, he was doing a really good job on the offensive glass. Rebounding was a huge issue, another huge issue tonight as well, and I'll get into that. But the Grizzlies only went 10 for 35 from three, and like I alluded to, they had a little bit of negative regression. They shot basically just as bad as the Mavericks from three, but when it mattered most, John Contra, I think, knocked in a three-pointer there late. Aldama may have had one. Kennard had one, I remember distinctly, where he came off a DHO and it hit like the front rim and dropped in. And I mean, that's a hallmark of a really good team, even despite not having their best player, still being able to make shots when it matters most, despite having a rougher shooting game. This is a team that, I mean, I don't know their exact 3-point shooting numbers, but, they, from the times that we've played them, they've been kind of up and down in terms of their 3-point shooting. But I mean, they got guys that can make shots without a doubt. But, Desmond Bane, 1 for 7 tonight, Dillon Brooks, 1 for 4. They were having a rough go at it tonight, but they were able to really step up when it mattered most. And that's something the Mavericks unfortunately couldn't do, even though they did have better shooting throughout most of the course of the game, right? And that definitely came to the Mavericks' downfall. So, I mean, after, Dallas goes off for 36 points in that third quarter, despite Kyrie, re-aggravating that foot or whatever, I believe, in that third quarter from Dillon Brooks and everything, the Mavericks are just doing a really good job, continually pushing the pace. They were running a lot of zoom actions for Kyrie's. There was a lot of staggers that they ran with either of the point of attack ball handlers, of which most of the time in the third quarter was either Josh or Kyrie. And particularly when it was with Kyrie, there was just so much screen navigation and Grizzlies defenders flying everywhere and just a lot of confusion. And the Mavericks really were able to open up the offense because of that. They were able to swing it around the horn at that point. They weren't necessarily creating like 4-on-3 scenarios, but it definitely sort of threw the Grizzlies defense off kilter at times. And the Grizzlies have some studs defensively. So, that's really impressive. And a lot of Mavericks, particularly like Green or even Reggie at times or Davis, they were all cutting and they were all attacking off closeouts. And they were just doing a really good job, like getting into the holes of the Grizzlies defense. The Grizzlies went to zone stretches of this game, but they predominantly played man most of the time. And the Mavericks were just finding those gaps there in the third quarter. And that really led to them scoring that much, of course. And then the eventual downfall in the fourth quarter, where the Mavericks, they have a decent start. Christian Wood and Kyrie are sort of spearheading that attack as the quarter ensues. Christian Wood, he had a few good plays where he was operating late in the third and early fourth, where there was one play where like Davis caught the ball at like the nail area, and Christian Wood kind of just slipped a double team and was able to get a nice dunk. They, like I said, the Mavericks were just kind of pinpointing the nooks and crannies of the defense, something that we don't really see a whole lot of, because the Mavericks obviously have to have a little bit more off-ball movement when they're not as, they're obviously not going to be as cluttered with Luka and Kyrie out there, just from an offensive, movement perspective. It's not going to be as cluttered together. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or an indictment upon Luka or Kyrie, but there's obviously a lot more ISO ball, and, guys get caught ball watching a little bit more. And that's not even, a lot of that's by design, of course. But, there has to be a lot of more off-ball movement because the Mavericks just don't have other sources of offense. But nonetheless, Kyrie, I think he took a little bit of a break in that fourth quarter. But whenever he came back onto the court, the Mavericks had just had a drought where they missed like 8 or 9 straight field goals leading down the stretch there after about the 4 or 5 minute mark, I want to say. And they just couldn't buy a shot. And the Grizzlies just slowly but surely chipped away to the lead until they were up. They outscored the Mavericks by 17 in that fourth quarter. And the Mavericks even were getting good looks. They were creating space just as they were doing in that third quarter, like I alluded to, but they just weren't able to drop. Kyrie was having a rough go at it. They were sending 2 at him, and he was kind of forcing some shots late in the game. I think we could probably attribute some of it to him getting a little bit too overzealous with some of those attempts, just really trying to find his way after he was having some rough woes. But just team wide, the Mavericks just couldn't hit a shot. It was as simple as that. And if you can't hit a shot when it matters like that, then yeah, you're going to lose. They got outscored by 17 in the fourth quarter. And that's why I'm talking about this as just such a degrading loss, because, down the stretch, it was just there for the Mavericks taking. The Grizzlies just didn't have the most outrageous of, insane comebacks. It wasn't like the Mavericks were like up 30 and they simply just couldn't keep up with the insane pace of the Grizzlies 3-point shooting or something like that. The Mavericks literally just blew this, and I don't have any sort of summation to it other than they couldn't hit a shot. I could try to get all intricate and talk about the schematics of everything offensively and what wasn't working. You could probably maybe make the argument that with Kyrie injury hampered, that they should have rode the coattails of some Jaden Hardy shooting, because he made 2 threes early on in that fourth quarter that were really huge. He was and he got to the rim. He scored 8 out of the Mavericks' 12 points in the fourth quarter, which is really saying something. He was doing a really good job leading the Tide in the second half. Him and Christian Wood working together in the roll game really opens up a lot of space. So that was a good tandem in that fourth quarter. But barring that, you got your best players down the stretch in there. They rode Christian Wood out into that fourth quarter, who up until that point had a pretty good game. He obviously had some offensive woes, but there was just a lot of unfortunate breaks and bouts for the Mavericks. Christian Wood got an offensive rebound at one point, and he traveled, taking one extra step, and then try to get the ball back up there, and of course it goes in. Just a lot of stupid stuff like that. And conversely, the Grizzlies continually took shots despite not necessarily having the best shot diet all night. Majority of their shots were, going out the front rim or hitting back iron, but they stayed persistent and they brought this one home. And just in terms of the degradation of the loss, it really sucks because of the whole Dillon Brooks thing, of course, where he was just, acting like an absolute clown. He dunked on Maxey at one point in this game, I believe in like the second or right after the Kyrie thing, actually. So maybe in the third quarter, but he dunks on Maxey, beats, I think it was Kyrie off the dribble. Maxey's the help side defender, just can't get to him on time. And I mean, it's a fairly weak dunk and he kind of grazes it over the rim with his left hand. And he excessively celebrates and then gets his 18th technical of the year. So he's already served 2 suspensions. That would make me presume because he had his 16th and 17th already respectively. So he's already served 2 one-game suspensions. He leads the NBA in technicals, so he gets a technical for that. I mean, I can, I get the whole animated being passionate towards the crowd, but it's just like very extra for some of these plays. And, he overreacts to every foul call and, he plowed through Kyrie. There were some times throughout this game where he's kind of just like clobbering guys across the face and things of that nature. And I mean, I'm hesitant to call anybody a dirty player necessarily. That's a very harsh tag. And, I got to see like a very repeated track record for me to label a guy that, but it goes without saying that he had some dirty plays tonight. I think we can all agree upon that. And just a general guy that, it's very hard if you're not a Grizzlies fan to like the aura of this guy. So you couple that with the factor of the Mavericks blowing, I think like a 14-point lead at one point in that third quarter. It's just really rough for this juncture in the season because I think that there was a sort of preemptive, I wouldn't say sort of like just know all that the Mavericks are. I know that was a weird way to put it, but I didn't have any sort of sense that like it was a for sure thing that they were going to win because the Mavericks have blown wins countlessly and, timelessly all season, right? But there was a quiet confidence that, this late in the year, I think the Mavericks probably have enough wit to up into this point. It's game 72. They really need this game. Every win is paramount to them forwarding their playoff agenda at this point in the year. And, you just hope that this team had a little bit more wherewithal and wit and in those gritty moments, and they don't. And they blow the lead. They got comfortable. That's what irks me the most. It wasn't necessarily even the clutch time offense. I mean, that happens to the best of us. Mavericks had a good clutch time game right before this, but the comfortability aspect and just getting slightly looser on those defensive rotations was pretty just by the eye test. You could see that as the game evolved over the end of the third and beginning of the fourth quarter. And it's just really, it's an unfortunate bout. And there's no other way to put it. It sucks. It really does suck that the Mavericks are in this position. And this team is just a hallmark of absolute inconsistency from game to game. I wish it was different, but it's not. And I don't really know what else to tell you guys other than, we have 9 games left or 10 games left and we need Luka back. And I kind of denoted this on Twitter as really the last game that I thought they could afford to miss. I mean, the situation will get dire if, particularly we don't even know what's going to be up with Kyrie's status if he has to miss a game or two because of these, because of his foot soreness. And I mean, the Mavericks are just in a spot where because of their 2 best players, they have to try and make the play-in or the playoffs or just get as high a seeding as possible. This is something that I have been pushing and, most of people on Mavs Twitter can formally agree with, but at the same time, it obviously potentially be more beneficial if they were able to keep their top 10 protected pick. That's owed to New York. But dropping that much with 10 games left and, it would just have to be like so intentionally for them to have, to be a guaranteed top or top 10 bottom team, if that makes any sense in the West, in the NBA. They would have to do so very intentionally. And I just don't think that that's going to happen. Now, obviously keep in mind that they can still be a top 14 bottom team and still end up, getting a lottery pick and getting their top 10 protected pick back, which, that could be a scenario that presents itself, but the odds are obviously insurmountably lower at that point versus if they were actually within those bottom 10 spots. So We'll just have to see how the situation evolves, but nonetheless, as a Mavericks fan, you have to be pining for your team to make the playoffs. Even, if secretly in your head, you think this might be the best case scenario. This is the situation that this team has put themselves in, but strangle holding themselves with the Kyrie Irving trade. And I use that term very gingerly because yes, the Kyrie Irving trade is a great thing from the Mavericks perspective that they got their second star in the middle of his prime of his career, maybe late prime, but he's still got at least 2-3 years of great basketball if he stays healthy. But they didn't address any of the concerns that were also kind of opened up by Dorian Finney-Smith leaving, but we're also already there, and they're amplified even more so. And that's obviously the perimeter defense and the rim protection woes, which the Mavericks never really have had a rim protector all season. And that's obviously coming back to bite them at this juncture. They thought that maybe they could just get away with Kyrie and Luka, but Luka is experiencing the just wear and tear of a very long season at this point. And you can tell that it's starting to eat at him, right? And we're seeing him miss a fifth straight game because of this thigh contusion. Hopefully he gets back soon, but as Jason Kidd said towards the beginning of the year, we are going to see if he's either human or from another planet, and it's looking like Luka's human. And that's not to say that he's not an incredible basketball player, but obviously it's just hard to expect this from a guy time in and time again. 72, 82 games throughout a whole NBA season, and for him not to experience some sort of injury woes throughout it. And he had stayed relatively healthy. He had missed had a couple little late cuts and stuff like that, missed second nights of back-to-backs, but nothing like this up until this point in the season. And it really does suck. And the Mavericks are sort of barely scraping by, playing 500 basketball right now, 14-22 on the road. It's something that has to get fixed as soon as possible. And, in terms of my confidence in this team this late in the year, it's definitely at like 50-50 because that's how they've operated all year. You don't know exactly how this team's going to play on a given night, right? And this, like I said, they're just the hallmark of absolute inconsistency. So we're going to have to see how these last 10 games end up evolving, as I have obviously hammered throughout this whole podcast and other podcasts, but it's going to be largely dependent on, how healthy Luka and Kyrie are. And that's, one of the huge contributing factors. The rotation kind of is what it is at this point with 10 games left. I mean, I don't know how much more it's going to change up. Christian Wood playing a little bit more is a nice sweetener. Even, I think Jason Kidd's kind of using him in the right lineups with two bigs and things of that nature to cover up some of his rim protection woes. So, you're getting that extra little punch of offensive output, but a lot of it doesn't matter if Luka and Kyrie aren't healthy. So who knows what the ceiling is of this team. We'll get into that in other podcasts, especially as, we get closer to the playoffs and stuff. But this loss definitely sucks without a shadow of a doubt. But otherwise, I'll go ahead and get into some individual performances from this game as we look throughout the roster, kind of who played well and who didn't. First off, we have Maxi Kleber tonight. He was one of the few Mavericks that actually did a good job boxing out tonight against a conglomerate of Grizzlies guys, between Tillman, Aldama, and Jaren Jackson Jr. that were just hammering the Mavericks on the boards. That was another big reason. I mean, obviously the Mavericks, just being a smaller team and what have you, they got out rebounded 37-50 tonight. And that was a pretty big reason as to why the Grizzlies brought this home, because they created a lot of second possessions with a lot of those offensive rebounds. The Mavericks had 8 offensive rebounds tonight. The Grizzlies had 17. And, some games the rebounding matters more than not. It's not something that, I'm going to hammer the nail right on the head as hard as other fans, because I think rebounding in the modern NBA can be mitigated to some extent. Like if you're a bad rebounding team, just if you have all the other parts in place to remediate that, just by being a very, perimeter defensive oriented inclined team. And, you opt to play a little more small ball. You can kind of get away with some rebounding issues at times if, you're always just running and, you're go, really fast paced team. But the Mavericks are not necessarily that, I guess, to say the least. And their size does come back to bite them in some games. Some games it doesn't, because they play opponents with not too all dissimilar issues to themselves. But in a game against a Grizzlies team like that, who does, even with Brandon Clark and Steven Adams out, they're still going to sort of up the ante in terms of their size in the front court versus the Mavericks. And they obviously had a lot of those woes. But Maxi Kleber himself did a fairly good job tonight. He was doing a really good job as a help side defender after maybe some early bouts in that department where he wasn't rotating as well. But I mean, offensively, he just wasn't really doing a whole lot tonight after, and I'm not really knocking him or anything. I liked the starting lineup that the Mavericks went to with him, Bullock, Kyrie Irving, and Dwight Powell. I like the whole two big dynamic that the Mavericks are doing. And I thought Maxi's athleticism, he was looking a little bit better tonight. He definitely looked a little bit more spry, like he was guarding on the perimeter a little bit better, was helping and stuff like that. But I mean, he just didn't get too many looks offensively. He missed 2 threes, and I believe like he was either a pull-up jumper or like a layup or something. And then he made 2 free throws when he like attacked off a closeout and did this little like fadeaway thing, and he got fouled. So good game from him, but nothing incredibly special. You would like to at least see Maxi hit 1 or 2 threes a game. I think that's a sort of standard benchmark we could come to expect from him as he ramps up his health going to the playoffs. We're seeing it a little bit, but otherwise, I thought he did a good job. He did a good job rotating the ball tonight, just being a good ball mover, had 4 assists. Reggie Bullock, he made a 3 tonight, got out in transition a couple times. Was another guy who did a good job as a ball mover, but didn't necessarily get the most amount of looks tonight as the Grizzlies defense started scrambling a little bit more in that second half. Very average game from him. Dwight Powell obviously got into early foul trouble, as I alluded to. He was having a really rough time against Jaren Jackson Jr. There were a couple times where Jackson slacked off him so hard that he was able to attack him, and I think he got like 1 or 2 buckets because of that. But I mean, Jaren Jackson Jr. disrupts everything in the dunker spot by his ability to close out on guys from really deep, but also backtrack to Powell if he needs to and disrupt any sort of the pick and rolls the Mavericks are running. And once Powell got into foul trouble trying to guard him at the other end, it just kind of severely mitigated his effects. Even with, bringing another help side defender, just off that starting lineup with Maxi having a little bit of an issue of rotating and helping throughout those first 6 minutes, it kind of hindered Dwight's effects throughout the rest of the game, as we only saw him play 12 minutes, and the Mavericks went to Christian Wood throughout large stretches of this game because, he wasn't as in bad of foul trouble, and he was playing a little bit better offensively because he has that ability to stretch the floor, which Dwight does not. And against a guy like Jaren Jackson Jr., that just severely limits you with how good he is at the rim. So I think that was that's basically the summation of how Dwight played tonight. And it's a pretty bad game from him, but not necessarily his fault. It's a tough position for him to be in. We know that he's not going to be able to do that necessarily in terms of being able to play both ends wire to wire against Jaren Jackson Jr. So it just kind of is what it is. Kyrie Irving, I talked kind of ad nauseum about him already. He had 0 assists in this game, which I did kind of want to pinpoint because we just can't afford to have that happen, especially late in the game. I mean, I know Jackson Jr. is just such a defensive valve, and he can really remediate possessions and patch things up that maybe the Grizzlies otherwise shouldn't get away with. But even then, I mean, you got to be able to find, some nooks and crannies in the defense at some point. Mavericks shooters were really not making anything tonight. But Kyrie was kind of ball dominant. You did see him kind of force the issue with some of those shots down the stretch, but he played so well in the first half and he was knocking down so much that I don't want to just knock him too heavily from that assist aspect, but he did a great job on defense tonight. He had 2 blocks, he had a steal, and he was just hustling his ass off, man. I mean, he was doing, the swipe down. If he got even blown by for a second, there were times that Bane or Brooks blew by him, and he was just doing a really good job with the swipe down and everything like that, knocking it off guys' knees, getting the ball out of bounds, just really savvy. He was doing a great job rotationally and helping, but you'd like to see him, just be a little bit better playmaking, find the gaps in the defense a little bit more. The Grizzlies did a good job of rotating and scrambling, as I had alluded to throughout most of that second half. But, even so, a guy like Kyrie, he's got to have more than 0 assists. I mean, point blank, right? But he had a really good first half shooting the ball after he re-aggravated that injury. He had a rough time getting it going. Throughout that first half, just doing his ability, as I already talked about, his off-ball movement and how he was, using that to get in some of those post fadeaway mid-range jump shots. But I mean, even in that third quarter, he was just doing a really good job, like probing and snaking on these pick and rolls, getting into the lane and creating space for himself as well as others. Even if he didn't get any assists, I mean, he creates a lot of space for others, especially as I kind of allude to with those hockey assists, where he swings it to another guy and they get to another guy on the perimeter. The Mavericks move the ball around the horn because of the, if you run Kyrie off like a double stagger one way and then the other, that's going to confuse the hell out of the defense more often than not. And it's going to create some sort of mismatch that the Grizzlies can't scram switch out of. And, you're going to see the Mavericks offense really start to get humming with some of the looks that they're able to create. But just in that second half, the Mavericks were not able to do enough of that, and just in terms of making the shots, because they were getting fairly decent looks, but it was what it was. But Kyrie, he played a pretty good game, but besides the third and fourth quarter, which were honestly like a pretty big abomination from him. But I mean, everybody has off games, and it's not like he had a lot of turnovers. I just attribute a lot of his woes to just having a bad shooting night, and it sucks. There were times where I wish he would have diverted maybe to Wood or Hardy a little bit more when he just really couldn't get it going. There were some overzealous shots and just maybe some bad takes from him. But other than that, I mean, I'm not going to knock him beyond that. He had 28 points, led the Mavericks in scoring tonight, and had a really good first half. So Josh Green, he had a very good game offensively, kind of got his groove back from that aspect. The Mavericks ran him off some GHOs, let him bring the ball up a little bit more, especially in a game without Luka. But with Kyrie, I was glad to see Josh be a little bit more aggressive offensively. I think it was something that they talked about pre-game with him just needing to attack a little bit more because, ever since Luka and Kyrie have been playing together, and, obviously not the past 5 games, but it seemed as if ever since, Josh Green's role was rescinded for those 2 games from the starting lineup en route to playing Justin Holiday, who didn't play tonight, by the way, it kind of just seems as if his confidence took a shot. And, in the games that Kyrie and Luka were both out, obviously he was still taking heed in tandem with Jaden Hardy with a lot of the offense. But now we're seeing him get a little bit of his aggressiveness back, which is really good. And he was able to get to the rim, there was one play in particular where he kind of faked Jaren Jackson Jr. off a little like give and go type deal with Dwight Powell in that third quarter. And that was really impressive. And the fact that he was able to make a layup over him. And he was just doing a really good job getting downhill. He took a few dumb shots and got his absolute shit swatted by Xavier Tillman one play. But otherwise, I thought he played a pretty good game. But still, defensively, he's getting blown by. He's out of position a lot more despite the speed. And, he's just being a little bit preemptive on some of these closeouts where he's going hard. And he's not anchoring down to a stance. And he's, steal hunting at times. And I just want to get away from that. We've seen him kind of do that ever since he got revoked from the starting lineup. So that's something that he's got to patch up. And, he's obviously hasn't been shooting the best lately, but I did like the way that he played offensively, getting downhill and running in transition tonight. Christian Wood, I thought, played a fairly decent game. We saw a couple times where he got blown by Santi Aldama, and, he's not particularly the blow-by master, but he did a really good job establishing himself within the non-Kyrie minutes and taking control of the Mavericks offense. Yeah, he went 6 for 13 tonight, but he was getting to the free throw line and he was attacking mismatches accordingly. The Mavericks were setting him up throughout, multiple different pick actions to get him those mismatches, and against any like sort of, shorter weak or not shorter, no, they're not weaker, but shorter Grizzlies bigs like Tillman or even Aldama, who he just has a little bit of a skill gap advantage over. He was, doing his best and his darndest to get inside and get to the rim. He wasn't settling. He took 3 threes, but he knocked in one of them, and he was just doing a really good job attacking. And tonight they ran a little bit more like direct Kyrie actions with him, which was solid to see, and that creates some space for him. And he was slipping to the hole a little bit more, got some buckets in the pick and roll, and the Mavericks went to him in the 4-on-3 scenario a few times, and he was able to distribute out of that. He pushed the ball in transition. Another good assist night for him. 6 assists, 9 rebounds. A pretty damn good game from him. He had 20 points. He struggled a little bit down the stretch, and he had a few bad turnovers. Otherwise, I didn't think the defensive woes were really that all too bad. I thought he played relatively pretty good tonight. But I'm glad the Mavericks rode him down the stretch. I thought that was the right move, but not the most insane game from him, but he definitely played pretty good off the bench. Davis came in, he knocked in a three. Actually played some decent defense. They used him in those two big lineups, as I alluded to, when Maxey had to get a little bit of a breather and Powell was still in foul trouble. They used him in those two big lineups with Wood, and he tried his ass off on defense, man, against Jaren Jackson Jr. Obviously couldn't hold up some possessions, but he came in, played some solid minutes for what it's worth in terms of his team defense, and kind of had a rougher going in terms of his shooting tonight, but made a three. So, what more can you ask for? Even though you obviously can ask for more threes for him to make, but on a rougher shooting night, it is what it is. Tim Hardaway Jr., he just wasn't really too aggressive in this one. He was questionable coming into this one. Still kind of having some injury bouts, and obviously in the last game he was kind of dealing with that too. You can see it's inhibiting him a little bit out there just in terms of his aggressiveness, and he couldn't really get anything going offensively. He only shot 4 shots tonight, which is very uncharacteristic of him. He made one pull-up mid-range jump shot on the baseline, played 25 minutes, but you can see why the Mavericks didn't go to him down the stretch when he's not having a good offensive game like that. There's just no reason to play him down the stretch because the defense just isn't worth it. But, I'm not going to say he struggled mightily, but I would have liked to see him, oddly enough, this sounds like a sort of non-applicable criticism to Tim Hardaway Jr., but I would have liked to see him be a little bit more aggressive and try to find his own shot tonight. But I thought he rotated well. He had a few good steals where he jumped the passing lanes off some, Grizzlies penetration and kicks. So, he's, like I said, he's a decent, man defender, and he can stick to his guy and get some steals as a benefactor, or kind of just as a result of that. But he obviously, struggles within the team concept a little bit more. So it was nice to see him actually jump a few passing lanes and, be just kind of savvy in terms of his defensive rotations tonight. Frank Ntilikina came in for like 7 minutes and provided some of the best basketball I've seen him play all season. He made 2 threes off of like guard pick and rolls. And on top of that, he did a really good job just attacking and kicking out. He was doing a really good job penetrating and kicking. He played some good defense at the other end. But other than that, he just didn't get a whole lot of bites at the apple. And on this one, unfortunately, the Mavericks opted to go to him instead of Justin Holiday, which was odd. But other than that, I was surprised that he didn't play a little bit more. But he, when he was in there, he played good. I don't really know if that's an applicable criticism of Jason Kidd from a rotation perspective, because we're talking marginally at the end of the bench. But it was good that Frank came in and provided some valuable minutes for the Mavericks. And the last guy we'll be getting into today is going to be Jaden Hardy, of course. And I thought that he had an excellent game. He was doing a really good job on just taking what the defense gave him, diagnosing pick and roll coverages. If guys are going under, he was pulling for that step back three and he was draining it confidently. I talked about him a little earlier in the podcast already, but, I thought he did decent defensively as well. And, if guys, if they were playing any sort of drop scheme with Jaren Jackson Jr., he was doing a good job kind of synchronizing into some of those mid-range jump shots and also knowing when to attack. Like I kind of, I talked ad nauseum about him at the beginning of the podcast, just with the whole rookie wall complex and everything like that. But he played an excellent game. And I think it's got to a point for me, at least, where he needs to at least be featured within the rotation consistently, because he's had too many important moments and too many important games to where it's just negligible going into the playoffs. I think he's at least got to get like 10 to 15 minutes for, the experience aspect, but also like he actually contributes to that team. I don't think that argument applies anymore, where it's just like, you can't play Hardy because he didn't contribute. I think that he has a proven track record up to this point in the season where, where these last like 20 or 30 games or so, when he gets his opportunities, he cashes them in more often than not. So you'd like to see him, play more because of that. And he may not get the craziest shot every time that he goes out there, and he may not get the most amount of minutes, or he may not have the best game, but he can help marginally, man. And I think that he just is so good from a tertiary ball handling perspective that you just could really use his extra boost that he gives. And he's not a black hole defensively. So I have a call to at least see consistent Jaden Hardy minutes, even if they're not a whole lot. I'm okay if they're not a whole lot, but as long as they're consistent. I've gotten to that place with him. So otherwise, gripes with the rotation tonight. I thought the whole Frank Justin situation was weird, but the way Frank was playing, I mean, I would have liked to see him play a little bit more, especially as the Mavericks could have, I mean, oddly enough, I mean, he was playing good offense. So I don't know. I just thought that they could have maybe used a little bit of a boost defensively on the perimeter. They always can. So I don't know. I thought, you may have, I would have liked to see them go to him a little bit more. Other than that, though, like just a really a rough outing, and from the perspective that they dropped the lead, and that's really what it comes down to, because it was there for the taking, but and it just sucks. It just sucks. Otherwise, though, guys that impressed me from the Grizzlies' perspective, Tyus Jones, man, he's just so savvy. I mean, he's one of the best backup point guards in the league, but he is extremely tough because it seems as if he plays every single pick and roll in terms of his ability to probe and take what the defense gives him just like exactly right, finds every single gap or dishes to the exact right guy. He only had one turnover tonight in 35 minutes, went 7 for 10, uber efficient from the field, 16 points. He played, hell of a game. I already talked about Jaren Jackson Jr. a ton, made a 3 tonight. But other than that, man, like he was just killing the Mavericks inside, getting to the basket on Dwight Powell, whoever was guarding him for that matter, whether it was Davis, Maxey, Christian Wood, eating them alive on the offensive glass. He had 3 offensive rebounds. We're at 28 points. He did a hell of a game. Dillon Brooks, I'm not even going to talk about him. He went 3 for 9. He sucks. And I've talked about him enough this podcast. Desmond Bane, he had a rough outing shooting wise, but he was still getting downhill per usual and, doing that, his whole penetration and kick action. But he did have a few clumsy turnovers. He had 6 turnovers in this one. And the Grizzlies only had 11 as a team, but I don't know. I mean, from that perspective, you'd like to see him, if you're a Grizzlies fan, of course, you'd like to see him control the ball a little bit more, especially for a guy that's seen, kind of as a remediating force and more of a, sort of, calm down to, some of the crazy hectic stuff that Ja does when he's out there sometimes. But, when you give a guy like that increased responsibility, sometimes stuff like that happens. But, he didn't shoot the ball well, but he definitely helped them a lot in this game. Santi Aldama, man, he had 14 rebounds, 5 offensive and 9 defensive. And I mean, he gave the Mavericks issues rebounding the ball tonight. And he was just doing a really good job attacking off closeouts at times. He made a few threes, got to the free throw line a bunch because of those offensive rebounds, and he just ate the Mavericks alive from that perspective. And he just seems like always like one of these like end of the bench role players, always goes off against the Mavericks when they're playing the Grizzlies. And, and tonight it was just because of the rebounding woes. And I mean, I'm not going to say that, he basically dominated from the Bigs perspective, really playing as a 4. Like he was the second big in most of these Grizzlies lineups. But he just does a really good job, like, getting guys on his hips and crabbing guys. But like I said, he just kind of dominated in every single aspect as a big, really besides, defensively, the Mavericks were able to still kind of score on him. But I mean, he had a hell of a game, man. Other than that, Luke Kennard, he played relatively well tonight. He had, he came off he was just really good at relocating as a shooter, made that 1-3 off that DHO. That was like kind of like total BS. Doesn't play as bad defense as I think he gets knocked for. And I mean, he's just really savvy. And, gets within the gaps and stuff. So he had a good game. Conchar, great hustle player, got 7 rebounds tonight. One of the best rebounding kind of like wings, hybrid wing guards, whatever you want to call it, in the league. And he played a good game tonight. David Roddy, he didn't have as near as good a game as he did the first couple Mavericks games, but there were still a few plays where he hustled hard and he came away with 6 boards tonight and, played some decent defense. So that's really all I got for you guys today. It was a really unfortunate and sucky loss, but I mean, we just take this game by game at this point. Hope Luka comes back. That's all we can do. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Make sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever listening platform you are on. Give us a 5-star rating if you so please. We would really appreciate it. And if you guys could review for us, make sure if you guys are watching on YouTube, shout out to the YouTube gang to like, comment, and subscribe. The Mavericks next game, since Jaren isn't here, I got to get this for you guys. Let me pull it up. The Mavericks' next game is going to be against the Golden State Warriors at 6:30 on March 22nd. So that is going to be Wednesday. And comment, how do you think going from game to game the interactions will be versus the Warriors and both the Grizzlies? Because we saw kind of a playoff sort of intensity atmosphere tonight versus the Grizzlies. Let's see, are we going to see something similar from Draymond? He's not as out of pocket as Dillon Brooks, but do you think that we're going to see some playoff intensity atmosphere type basketball, or is it just going to kind of be a sort of slow down, low lullaby game? We'll see. Comment what you think down below. That wasn't the best YouTube prompt I've given you guys, but I had to think of something on the spot. Otherwise, a really degrading loss for the Mavericks, but we got to move forward and just pray for good health. That's all we can do at this juncture in the season, and see how far this team can get before we get to the offseason. Otherwise, it's just a sad state of affairs over here on the Mainstream Mavs podcast, but luckily we'll have Jaren back for the next game, so hopefully that just is a biggest cure-all that I could ever ask for. But otherwise, praying for good health for the Mavericks and for every one of our listeners, and we will catch you guys in the next one.